Most students think that the A-level required practicals are just about remembering the 12 experiments, or at least for AQA that is. But they often are completely unaware that what actually gets mainly assessed in the exam is in a different part of the specification, and it gets completely overlooked in their revision. So stick around to find out how you can make sure your students are preparing for the practical skills in the A-level exams the best way they can to boost their mark and grade. Hey there teachers, welcome to Miss Estruch Teach and Tell, the podcast where every week I dive into all the tips and tricks that make teaching life so much easier. Whether you're a veteran educator, an early career teacher learning the ropes, or balancing the classroom with being a busy parent, this will help you streamline your workload and bring a bit more balance to your life. You bring the coffee and I'll bring the teach and tell. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Miss Estruch Teach and Tell, the podcast that helps busy teachers save time, reduce stress and get practical strategies for the classroom. I'm Katie Estruch, your host, and today we're diving into one of the trickiest areas of A-level biology, teaching the required practicals. But before we get started, a quick favour, if you're finding these episodes useful, please leave a review and hit follow. It really helps more teachers find these tips and frees up their evenings as well. Alright, let's get into it. The required practicals, which was this new feature to A-levels when the specification changed in 2015. And every exam board does it slightly differently. I've only got the experience of teaching AQA, that's what I'm going to be talking about, but I do know that OCR do it slightly differently, but there's going to be similarities and overlaps in the points that I am making. Now, when we think about the required practicals, most of us immediately jump to that list of the 12 required practicals. Enzymes, photosynthesis, the dissection, and so on. But here is the thing. What actually gets assessed in the exams most often is the apparatus and techniques table in the specification. And this has become more and more obvious to me because I do my past paper analysis spreadsheet every single year. And you might have seen me post videos on that this summer because I made it available to teachers if they wanted. And I'll link that video up here and also in the description. But every year I go through the OCR and AQA exam papers. And then I categorize which spec points were assessed, how many marks were linked to those. And I do it for the required practicals as well. And it is really hard to identify which required practical they were actually assessing. The reason being is they are often actually assessing the apparatus and techniques that link to a required practical rather than really obviously one of the 12 required practicals. And for that reason, students often come out of the exam saying, I can't believe it, there wasn't a single required practical on that paper and I revised all of these. But what they don't realise was, well no, it might not have obviously been there was an enzyme practical in there or the dissection practical or aseptic technique, but apparatus and techniques that link to those required practicals were scattered throughout. So my first piece of advice to you is to get your students to print out the apparatus and techniques table in the specification. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'll just show you it here so you know which table that I'm referring to if you aren't aware of it already. And I would get them to stick that into their work folder and also their practical lab books, assuming that they do have those two things. And also get them to have an electronic copy as well, because I know people use all sorts of different mediums now for their learning. And the reason I think this is so important is, while they may recognise an experiment in the exam is more likely to ask them about the equipment or what variables to control. And these are all explained or pointed towards in that table. So things like using a colorimeter, using a potometer, knowing suitable glassware to use for different things, knowing what equipment that you would use to measure pH, temperature, and so on, knowing how to use an optical microscope. You can see the table, the list goes on. So what I'd recommend is, number one, they definitely have this printed so they know how important this table is. I would also suggest making use of this table in your lesson content as well. So it could be make it into a short quiz at the start or the end of a revision lesson or a practical lesson. You could just pick out the skills and apparatus that are relevant to the practical you're about to do, or it could be a general revision lesson. And you can do that all by yourself, or you could use ChatGPT to help you to come up with some ideas for questions. Or I do have an entire active recall workbook that quizzes students on this already, which you could then use as well. Alternatively, you could set students the challenge of creating flashcards where you would have a skill on one side of the card flashcard and it described on the back, or it could be a technique. So list aseptic techniques, and then on the back you have a range of aseptic techniques. This could also be one of the revision lessons, that you get them to create those flashcards in the lessons, because then they've got you as support to ask you questions to help make the cards if they need. And then, as I already mentioned, I do have a practical apparatus and techniques active recall workbook specifically for students. So you could always direct the students to use that for their revision, or you can get a school license of that, so you could actively use that within your lessons as well. Now, that's one of the big things in terms of preparing students for the practicals. But let's now move on to the 12 required practicals themselves. And at my last school, this was the structure that my department tended to use when we had a required practical coming up. We would have a minimum of one prep lesson. We would use this to introduce the science behind the practical, to understand the aim, what we were actually investigating and why, and how that linked to the theory. We might use it to model any new skills. So for example, it might be streak plating. So they got to practice doing that on their agar plate before the actual experiments, so that the students had a chance to practice these skills in a low stake way before they were actually assessed in their required practical. Sometimes that prep lesson would be very much teacher led, and sometimes we'd link it to competency 5, the students being able to do their own research. We'd book a computer room and they would do the research themselves. Lesson 2 would be the practical lesson where they collect the data, and actually within the prep lesson and or for homework, we'd typically set as well that they need to have their risk assessment made and a table to collect the data, so that when we start the practical lesson, they are ready to go. And depending on where the students are at the start of year 12, end of year 12, year 13, you would need to give more or less support and modelled guidance for those skills. And then number 3 would be lesson 3, a follow-up lesson for the write-up, where depending on the practical, there might be 1 or 2 lessons this, or it might be some of it going into homework. But these write-ups I found really valuable in helping them to get a better understanding for critical analysis, which is going to be featuring a lot in paper 3, because you would get the students to calculate a mean, if it was relevant, standard deviation, a stat. They come to a conclusion, but then I would get them to evaluate that conclusion based on the method they were told to follow and their data, and really emphasize you are not critiquing the student's abilities. We are assuming everyone has followed the method correctly. You are critiquing, you're evaluating the method itself and the data, because that is what they're going to get in the actual exam. And they start to actually properly understand the importance of doing this critical analysis as well. So this routine kept things organised. It gave students enough time to fully understand why they were doing the practical, to understand the skills and get a thorough understanding of the write-up and evaluation. And to make life easier for you as a teacher, I've actually created a free resource for every single AQA required practical, where for each practical you have got an equipment list, a step-by-step method, data students can collect and how they should present it, top tips that for me as a teacher I came across that were common mistakes students made to warn them about, and little tips along the way to make sure they're doing everything accurately, as well as a risk assessment template. I'll link this in the description so you can download those teacher packs completely for free to support you before each required practical. And here is the really exciting part, or for me at least. Hopefully you're going to find this exciting and helpful as well. I am about to start filming every single required practical as well from a teacher technician point of view. So each video is going to focus on me actually doing the practical, showing the equipment, but also top tips that you can share with your students, the common mistakes to watch out for, so that you can head into delivering these required practicals confident and ready, being able to support your students as best as possible. So if you don't want your students missing out on marks in the exams, make sure they've got that apparatus and technique table at the front of their folder and the front of their mind in revision. Test them regularly on those, and check out my free resources that I've linked below. And don't forget to follow this podcast so you never miss an episode, especially those required practical videos coming up, which will exclusively be on the YouTube channel, because doing it as a podcast, listening to me doing a practical isn't going to be particularly helpful. I'm going to be modelling it all. So hopefully I'll see you over on the YouTube channel if you usually only listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's it for this week, and I'll see you very soon.